Hey, Night Gang. I accidentally left my mute button on, which I always have on when I first start the stream to make sure that I don't accidentally talk over the intro. So, hi everybody. This is a later evening stream because those of you who weren't trolling me on the Discord server decided that 8 p.m. would be the best time to start for the majority of you. So, welcome, all 28 of you. Holy crap. So, couple of quick introductory type announcement things. Like always, let's talk a little bit about what's been going on. So I am still not going to be talking about the recent drama. I know that that's disappointing to some of you. The term infighting here specifically refers to godly infighting. People asked me some starter questions in my Discord server about whether or not I think the gods fight with each other. So that is what I was talking about. I realized when somebody messaged me about it, like, hey, are you going to be talking about the drama tonight? No, that easily could be misinterpreted. Holy crap, Akeda, thank you so much for your $20 super chat. Looks like rain in Alleytown. Yeah, it was raining so heavily earlier. We got a little bit of a windstorm, knocked out power in a couple of places, knocked down a bunch of branches. It was not fun earlier. I went to go see my buddy who owns a coffee stand, and she ended up having to leave an hour early because she was worried that her street would flood out. So that's a big thing that happened, but not near as bad as what's going on like over in the East Coast and the Midwest. Holy crap. Y'all are dealing with some tornadoes out there. Know that my prayers and well wishes are with you. Not that there's much more that I can do at the moment, but I'm going to be watching that stuff for what's going on with folks like over there, because I am significantly more safe than everybody that's currently living in Tornado Alley. I've been watching all the news on that. I know that like a few folks that I know have been affected by it, so I'm hoping that everything turns out okay for you guys, and I know that there's probably going to be all kinds of fundraisers and things, and I'm going to be looking out for that to possibly consider doing a charity stream depending on the kind of damage, because like I know, for example, there's 100 people buried in an Amazon warehouse right now, or at least there was as of this morning, because of a tornado that blew through in, I think it was Illinois, but I might be wrong. But yeah, if you guys have a link on that story, feel free to tag me in the chat on that. Just because like I remember reading a little bit about it this morning, but I haven't been as up on it. I know that there's been a lot of protest for Amazon. But it might have been Kentucky. But yeah. Oh, Katie says it was Illinois. I guess if somebody can Google it and find that out. I remember reading about it this morning. I remember specifically reading about the Amazon warehouse. That's breaking news, like with all the stuff that's been going on. So yeah, as far as that goes, like I said, I'm still not talking about drama tonight. I do want to talk a little bit about just community discourse kind of in general and how we treat each other, because I think that that's something that we need to talk a little bit about. So I'm going to talk about a bit about that at the beginning. But I do feel as though I've said more or less everything that I'm going to say on the recent controversy between here and the Discord and like Twitter, where I've made my public announcement on everything. So I don't want to talk about that tonight. If you guys ask me about it, I will ignore the questions. I've said most of what I need to say. Some wonderful members of the community have also done some amazing education work in the Discord server as well. If you're not a part of the Discord, links always in the description of every video if you want to join. And the Indica Controversy channel is open to everybody, including those who just joined the server. So you can see the conversation there. As long as you're not abusive and not focused, you're welcome in the server. So like, feel free to take a look at all of that. Most of everything that I have to say on that matter is there. I know that I'm getting kind of called out heavily on both sides of the issue for like both working with Indica and with certain members of Indica to begin with, and for my decision to separate. The only thing I'm going to say about it now is that it was a very carefully considered decision that was based off of quite a bit of research that I did over several weeks and lots of conversations with Hindus and Indians from my own community, including a few people that were kind enough to walk me through things. That's all I'm going to say about that decision. I stand by it. I stand by the decision that I made. And I don't necessarily think that the person who invited me is a bad person, but I think that they've been caught up in some bad stuff. And that's about all I'm going to say about that. So Anyway, coming back to announcements and things, I'm really excited to announce that the calendar project is actually pretty close to getting ready for the Kickstarter. So I said that I wanted to get at least between 4 and 6 pieces of art completely done with my artist and over 6 months of dates done on the calendar itself, because I'm doing all of the actual interior design for the calendar personally in InDesign. And that is nearly completed. So sometime in the next week or two, I'm hoping, assuming that my artist doesn't have any more personal life issues that get in the way of getting that stuff done, that Kickstarter should be going up pretty soon for the calendar project. Because people keep asking me, hey, you announced this a few weeks ago. Like, why isn't this up yet? I wanted to make sure that enough of it was done to come as close as I can to guaranteeing that we'll get them shipped out by mid-January. That might end up getting pushed back as far as February because of all the stuff that's going on with the Postal Service right now. I don't know if you guys have been watching the news on that, but like between funding cuts and other issues that happened with the Postal Service, there's been all kinds of like shipping delays and stuff. I've had things get delayed for several weeks that seem to supposedly get lost in the post that were supposed to only take 2 or 3 weeks to get here. So if that happens, then even getting the calendar shipped here might get delayed. So I will keep everybody up on that once the Kickstarter launches. I will keep doing backer updates with new arts and stuff. Like once that happens, it'll probably only last a week or two for the Kickstarter itself. But if we raise enough, then I will order some extra calendars to have available on Etsy for folks that are interested. So that's what I'm working on right now. That's where a lot of my energy is going. I've also been working on the Common Hellenism book, so like that's been going on. I'm hoping to potentially start getting alpha readers sometime in the next 6 to 8 months, but it's a long journey between now and then. So coming back to the Q&A, wonderful starter topics, by the way, from the Discord and the brand new r/Common Hellenism subreddit, which I got actually 2 questions on there. So I'm excited to get into that. The stuff in the title is not clickbait. All of those are actually questions that I'm going to be starting off answering. But I'm going to start with the stuff from the Discord because I got a couple of silly questions. I am not going to shut up and take your money. I will take your money with complaints, good sir. I reserve the right to yell at you for giving me money. Thank you so much, Akeda. Thank you also, by the way, to the 2 folks at the beginning, Carpathia, and I think I saw one other, River, for your donations before the stream even started. Thank you so much, guys. So let's get back to the attempts at questions before Akeda so rudely interrupted me with his generosity. Let's start with the questions. So how do I feel about axolotls from Zen Lizard? Are they a manifestation of Xolotl? I do not know enough about Central American mythology to say that. However, I think axolotls are painfully adorable, and it breaks my heart that with their cute little facial smiles that I can't touch them or they'll die. So that is how I feel about axolotls. So let's see. Starter questions. Let's see. We have, do you believe the gods try and test mortals? How and why? Are there any particular gods or forces associated with fortune, luck, health, etc., who come to mind with you as you as a Hellenist deal with these different issues and challenges? How do hard times affect your relationship with them? So this is actually a really long and complicated question, so I'm going to take this in pieces. This is from a patron, actually, Daughter in the server. So to start with, do you believe the gods try and test mortals? Absolutely. That is attested in mythology. It is very much attested in ancient writings. Philosophers believe that. Absolutely, I do believe that the gods, I don't know if it's test so much as like testing faith, but I do believe that the gods do send us both fortune and misfortune to help us grow as people. And I do believe that, given that, again, when you're looking at like Hellenism, Hellenic polytheism, etc., when you're looking at the whole of that, the idea of faith and belief is significantly less important than action and honor. Like, faith or belief is basically taken to be a granted in most ancient writings. It's more so, what are you willing to do, so to speak? And so, to me, when you're looking at like the gods sort of sending misfortune potentially into your life, what I see there is an attempt to develop your virtue, because as Aristotle defined it, and again, we're going to look at a stream for Nicomachean Ethics coming soon. I'm getting all of my notes from when I was working on building the course for an organization I'm no longer affiliated with. Aristotle talked about virtue being the center between 2 vices. It's very individual, unique to each situation, and what the virtuous action does depend both on the context and the two vices. And so when you're looking at that, if you are sent challenging sort of situations, which I'm not saying the gods like send you misfortune to test your faith or anything, because again, I think that belief is generally taken as a granted when you're looking at Hellenic thought. I think that if the gods do send you misfortune, at that point you are now being put in that position where you need to find that middle between the two vices. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, basically, for example, I'm trying to think of a specific virtue. Courage is the center between cowardice, which would be like absolute fear of everything, the unwillingness to stand up, and like impulsivity, effectively, like the willingness, like the brashness, I guess, like the willingness to just go out and fight everything that moves regardless of your ability. So that is like when you're talking about courage is the center between those two things. So you might have an instinct toward one or the other, depending on you as an individual. And developing courage as a virtue, it might be, picking your battles if you lean toward brashness, or it might be the willingness to stand up in the first place if you lean toward cowardice, like in your daily life, because most of us tend to lean more toward one vice or another. So when you're talking about the gods testing you, quote unquote, what I think would happen here is an influence of like events to try to give you opportunities to cultivate the particular virtues that you are working on. If you're talking about like the gods and the way that specifically the Theoi seem to relate to their followers. So I guess I hope that answers your question. How or why? So I think that answers that. Are there any particular gods associated with luck, fortune, health, etc. that come to your mind as a Hellenist with these different issues and challenges? So I do not think that every instance of misfortune is a test from the gods. No. I think that much like other forms of UPG, there's usually some sort of signal that you'll get that it is a test of some kind, more so than I think that it's very easy to get to the superstitious mindset where you're like, oh, the gods are mad at me, everything's going wrong. I think that usually you'll get some sort of signal, either like a dream or a sign or an omen or something. You'll get a signal like other forms of UPG that it comes from the gods. So I don't believe that the gods kick you when you're down. No, I think that the gods help their followers that want to cultivate virtue to cultivate virtue. So let's see. As far as how do hard times affect my relationships with the gods, I feel like I turn to the gods during my hard times. There are times where I occasionally question, are the gods mad at me? I mean, all of us do. Like sometimes that's late in Christianity, but I mean, even the ancients did, right? But what I try to do quite often is I'll divine on it. And if I get signs that maybe there actually is some anger there, I'll offer propitiation, which I'm working actually on a script. It probably won't be done for a month or so because there's a ton of research that I'm doing on this, but I'm working on a script that is talking about the difference between propitiation and reciprocity. Alleviating the anger of so-called baneful or rageful gods or angry gods, gods that were largely sort of given offerings, much like heroes were, to stave off their anger rather than to build reciprocal relationships with. So I'm going to be doing a video on that and the differences between those two things and why some people may choose to offer to deities without the expectation of reciprocity that are considered baneful and such. I'm not going to be attacking or criticizing anybody that offers and, feels that they have a reciprocal relationship with those sorts of deities. I have no judgment for folks that do that. But when talking about sort of the historical perspective, I'll be talking a little bit about that, particularly things like the Erinyes, the Furies, Eris, that sort of thing, gods that primarily were offered to avert their gaze with the attestations we have. Now, there could be cults that we don't have records of for these gods, and that is absolutely a possibility, and I'm going to bring that up as well, but I'm working on that. So if I get some kind of sign from my divination that there needs to be propitiation, then I will make offerings, to hopefully help, to heal whatever rift might have been there, try to look more closely for signs on those sorts of things. But most of the time when I'm having rough times, I lean more heavily on the gods. And actually there are several votive offerings on my altar that are specifically thank you for helping me get through For example, Asclepios, I actually said a prayer when there was nobody in my hospital room because I was in the hospital on Monday. I talked a little bit about it in my server. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. Too Long didn't read what I thought was glutening on Monday was actually food poisoning. I had salmonella. It was awful. I ended up in the hospital. I passed out, actually, from severe dehydration. They had to give me 2 IV bags of fluid. And when I got there, I was kind of delirious. Like I was starting to come out of it because I had drank a glass of water before I left, but I was still severely dehydrated to the point where like my veins were collapsing and rolling when they were trying to put the IV in. And I said a verbal prayer to Asclepios that, hey, can you guide their hand after they stuck me like 4 or 5 times and could not get this in? And a nurse who was from, I guess, from the South was kind enough to come in, and she had experience with this that the other doctors and nurses didn't have, put 2 current tourniquets on my arm, was able to get the vein to stand up, and was able to get the IV in so they didn't end up having to do an ultrasound IV, which we weren't sure whether or not my insurance would actually cover. So like I ended up giving him a whole bunch of offerings today in thanks for that. So that was a moment where in my hard times, I feel like the gods somewhat protected me. So, like, that's where hard times, I turn to the gods for help. I turn to the gods for strength and comfort, but I also try to look at what I can do in the situations that I'm struggling with, what I can do in the situations where I feel like I'm being faced with awful choices. I try to focus heavily on what the virtuous option is with the gods in mind, with that sort of idea of pursuing virtue in mind. Not that I think that the gods require absolutely of us perfection or anything like that, but I think that striving towards virtuous behavior toward each other, towards upholding that sort of order, as it were, not order as in law, but order as in, you know, like reciprocity, as in the relations that we have towards each other as people. I think that hard times can and could, if you see it this way, bring out the best in us. And they're an opportunity for us to really show our true strength in those moments. That doesn't mean that I don't break down when things get hard. I absolutely do. I've had emotional breakdowns many times. But I also think that the gods understand that. I don't think that we're called to be emotionless in those moments. So I hope that that gives a good explanation of kind of my viewpoint on that and the gods testing us. Thank you so much, River. River says $5 super chat. That happened to my brother. He got the flu around age 8 and had to go to the ER because of dehydration. They said he narrowly avoided kidney failure. Yeah, they said something similar to me, that I could have started having organ failure within a few hours because I was so severely dehydrated. Like, they were shocked that they gave me 2 IV bags of fluid. And yeah, the Too Long didn't read is that they had to give me anti-nausea medication in the hope that it only coming out of one end would like mean that I could retain enough fluids that I wouldn't end up back in the hospital. So that's how sick I was. It was not fun. Turns out there's a salmonella outbreak related to like red onions from Mexico or something, and apparently it's in my state. It's in like 38 states. If you Google it, there's lots of info on that. So another starter question: what do you think about hard versus soft polytheism? So I have opinions on this. So I have a tendency to think that, then this is no offense to folks who are soft polytheists, but soft polytheism doesn't really make sense to me with the experiences that I've specifically had with the gods. When I attempted to approach deity through the soft polytheist lens, specifically when I was a Wiccan, which I'm going to stress, Wicca is a completely valid path for people who follow it. It is absolutely like okay, and I know that not all Wiccans believe this, but when I was one, I believed that all of the gods were like the god and goddess and various faces of them. I no longer believe that. My experiences with deity are that they are very, very different from one another, and I've had experiences with deities outside of the pantheons that I worship as well. So my opinion is that I am a hard polytheist. I am not the hardest of hard polytheists. Every single god absolutely exists. If you were to come up with a god right now, I would believe that it exists. I believe that the absolute majority of deities that we know of from history most likely are real, and I don't really have much of a reason to doubt that that's the case, given the near universal sort of community exposure to deity that we see, including sometimes the rediscovery of deities that significantly have been like lost to time, and then later information comes out about them and people talk about their experiences. So Angel, the difference between hard and soft polytheists believe that either all the gods are part of one source, say spirit, and they're all just sort of personifications, or some soft polytheists believe that there's like a group of X number of deities. For a lot of people, it's 12, or for some people, it's 2, like a god and goddess figure, or there's only one supreme being and all the gods and goddesses are just us interpreting that supreme being. So that's soft polytheism. Hard polytheism is each of the gods are individuals. So, like, some people believe that Mars and Ares are the same deity. A hard polytheist would say, no, Mars and Ares are both different gods. So I am closer to a hard polytheist. I absolutely believe that the gods are separate, and I don't think that the Roman and Greek gods are the same, even when Romans sort of syncretized with the Greeks. So there is a spectrum of hard to soft polytheism, absolutely. I tend to lean much further towards the hard side than the soft side personally, just because of my own experiences with the gods. So that's what the difference is. Like, that's the extreme and extremes on both ends. Mr. Monster says, never had anything spiritual happen, but I still believe in pagan gods. Also never saw aliens, but I know they exist. Thank you so much, Mr. Monster. So let's see. I'm trying to look through. There was a question here that I answered in the Discord server. So one of the questions that I alluded to in the title, this one's from the subreddit, which is, what do I think about messenger gods and the role that they play in Hellenism? So, as many of you know, one of my chief deities is actually messenger god. Hermes is one of the 2 gods that I feel the closest to. He has an epithet that effectively translates to most friendly of the gods to mortals. The messenger gods, I think, are vital to Hellenism. It was said that the messenger gods, particularly Hermes, but also there are others as well. The poster actually mentioned one. If you guys haven't checked out the r/common Hellenism subreddit, by the way, quick shell for that. I just started it within the last few days, and already there's quite a few wonderful topics going on. You guys should totally check that out. Link is in the description. Just open it up in a new tab or something. Check it out. But the role that I think that messenger gods play in the religion, it's pretty clear that at the very least in ancient times, it was believed that the gods don't tend to directly communicate with us. Rather, messages are facilitated by the messenger deities, because the messenger deities in their nature are able to approach us more easily than the gods do directly. Now, whether or not I fully believe that that's the case, I do know that the majority of my divine experiences have been either in dreams, or there's the one vision that I've talked about that happened while I was awake. But the majority of my experiences have been through dreams, which were said to be Hermes's realm. He was said to carry dreams, rather, alongside like Hypnos, who's the one who puts you to sleep. So I think that the messenger gods do play an essential role. It's said that Hermes is the most friendly of the gods to humans because he is so familiar with us, because he carries Zeus's messages for us, because he carries the messages of the other gods, because he's said to carry our prayers to Zeus. It's said that when you pray to Hermes, that it's possible for him to take those messages and bring them to the gods that are most interested in your plights. And so because of that, I think that it's very important, especially because Hermes also has a strong grounding with the sort of boundaries of the home, right? Like, you have the herms that were offered to and had wine poured on them, which I actually have a herm on the way. I'm really excited about that. So that, like, those offerings were done regularly, both in neighborhoods and on individual properties. So it's pretty clear that at the very least, for Hermes specifically, he played a pretty important role in terms of maybe not individual honor, but certainly, like, apart from his role in the boundaries, but certainly overall in our communications with the gods overall. Oh, Ty, that's your Reddit post. Welcome here from Reddit. So let's see. The one you feel close to is Theme. Thank you so much for your question. So let's see. I offered to Hestia as a sort of messenger goddess, carrying my prayers and offerings to the other gods, which actually, Katie, that is not too far off from the beliefs of the ancients in one of the it's either the Homeric or Orphic hymns. It is references specifically that Hestia is sort of the central abode, the magnificent perpetual fire who elevates the suppliants. So this is actually, you see this in the Labor's translation of this, in all of the Labor's sort of rituals in their, specifically their ritual book, Hestia does actually play a role of, through the central hearth fire, connecting us to the gods for home worship. It's why, one of the reasons why she receives first and last offerings for any sort of home worship, which for the majority of us means any sort of worship, because a lot of us don't worship as much outside of the home because, well, there's not a lot of places where you can do that very publicly, except if you maybe find a private spot out in nature, right? There's a lot of judgment and such. So, Hestia receiving first and last and her sort of connecting us to the other gods. One of my favorite things is cooking meals and such, I see as being as sort of a devotional activity to Hestia, because the stove, as it were, has replaced for many of us the hearth as sort of the centerpiece of the home. Like, life still revolves around the kitchen, as it were, for many people. Most of us don't have enough money to actually pay for all of our meals to be delivered or something along those lines. So to some degree, that sort of stove slash oven has kind of replaced the hearth in that way. And so the activities performed there in the kitchen are reminiscent of cooking on the hearth fire before offering in ancient times would have been. So that's actually not too far off of the sort of ancient viewpoint on these things. So let's see. I want to make sure that I'm not missing any more of the topics here. Oh, the infighting topic. So, infighting here is not referring to drama. It's actually referring to infighting between the gods. There was a question regarding whether or not I think that the gods actually fight with each other, or whether or not it is sort of a mythic expression of human understanding. So specifically, the example I want to give here is Athena and Poseidon, because you see multiple conflicts between the two of them throughout mythology. In the Odyssey, we see that Zeus actually refuses to help Odysseus because of Polyphemus, because specifically Odysseus's men stabbed Polyphemus in the eye, which ticked off Poseidon. So Poseidon is trying to keep Odysseus from coming home, because he's pissed at him for obvious reasons. He injured his son. He's mad. And, even though Odysseus is like, he broke Xenia, Poseidon's not having any of it, right? But Athena ends up sort of directly opposing Poseidon and working in behind the scenes with Odysseus to bring... Oh, it's Orphic Hymn 84 for the one that I referenced for Hestia. So thank you so much, Jamie, for that reference. So in the Odyssey, when you're talking about Odysseus, and you're talking about Athena sort of working with him behind the scenes, like lending her blessings, helping to guide his ship, which she was often worshipped to help keep ships safe when they were on the high seas, in addition to Poseidon. You see that sort of conflict between the two of them, which ultimately is resolved in Athena, quote unquote, winning when Odysseus not only gets home, but she gets to deflect the blows as he takes revenge on all of the men that were trying to boink his wife while he was gone. But there's also the story of the two of them vying for control as patron god of Athens. Athena, of course, offers the olive tree and ends up succeeding there as well. And there's this sort of pitting of the two of them against each other, supposedly, because of the fact that Athena is sort of this taming force, because Poseidon, he is, say, the father of horses, but Athena invents the bridle, which tames Pegasus, right? Like, you have Poseidon was the god of the wildest seas, but Athena was prayed to, in addition to him, for peace on ships. So you would see that there is this conflict constantly. But much like Katie just pointed out in the chat with Pan and the nymphs, you see something very similar with Athena and Poseidon, where for a lot of Polis holidays, their worshippers, like their priests, would actually walk side by side with each other in procession. They would receive offerings at many of the same ceremonies. Their mythology was often intertwined in what appeared to be conflict, but if there was a full conflict between those gods, it would not make sense for their worshippers to then honor them side by side, for their priests to walk side by side, for them to be honored in many of the same ceremonies for many of the similar reasons. So what I believe as far as conflicts with the gods is not necessarily that they don't exist, but that if they do, we don't really understand them. I know that this sounds like a cop-out, but hear me out. The gods are, as I've defined them, disembodied, unevolved, eternal minds. Now, whether they came into being with the universe or created it, excuse me, I'm still having a little bit of stomach issues, my apologies. But whether they came into being with the universe or whether they created it, I'm kind of agnostic on. I don't really know if it's possible to know that. But what I do know is that they seem to want relationships with us. And what I also know is that when you learn more about the way that our bodies and minds just function scientifically, right? A lot of the way that we exist has a lot to do with survival. There's a lot of things that we take for granted as part of our experience that are a direct result of survival drives and instincts. And because of that, the way our minds work, especially being confined to physical brains and nervous systems as they are, we're keeping the question of soul aside for a minute. Just the way that we experience reality currently as embodied beings is going to be radically, radically different than the way that a disembodied mind that is eternal would. If you don't have to worry about sickness and death, you're going to have a very different set of priorities. The experience of consciousness without a body, we can't fathom that. Like, it's part of the reason why, even if you believe in an afterlife, you might start panicking. Like just thinking about death. Sriram, what I mean by unevolved, what I mean is that they are not living organism beings that evolved on a physical planet, like in a contest for survival. What I mean by unevolved minds is that they are as they are. They are not the product of reproduction and evolution, as far as we know. If they are a product of a process that we are completely unfamiliar with because they are not embodied. That's what I mean by that. So I don't mean that the gods are like primordial and, like that they're evil or bad or anything like that. That's not what unevolved in this case means. What it means is specifically like life itself came into being, yes, outside the domain of natural selection, exactly. Life itself came into being through certain natural forces, and the gods don't appear to have come into being through those exact same natural forces, or if they do, they exist on a plane that is completely foreign to us as evolved beings. So when you're talking about trying to make sense of these incredible beings, it seems that the one universal language that we share with them is story. I've said this before, story and artwork. When, I did my interview with Pratamasu, we talked about how we tend to both feel closest to the gods when we're creating. And I talked about how divine ecstasy and like holy terror is very similar in many ways to the experience of flow state, but without the fear. Like specifically flow state is holy terror without the fear. Yeah, that again, heathenry simplified, absolutely. The gods didn't evolve, they simply exist. So that's what I meant by unevolved. So when you're talking about like this sort of experience of creation and art and that bringing us closer to the gods specifically, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at when I'm talking about how different the gods are. And so when we're talking about like story and the language of the gods and that way that we connect when we create, right? You might get a message as an artist of some kind, as a story writer, about the gods that you then have to translate through your evolved embodied mind, through your evolved embodied experiences. So when you look at mythology, you are looking at a person's attempt to translate revelations about the divine into a medium that makes sense, aka story, while still being limited by the experiences of their time and place, because the storyteller is only going to have what they bring in order to translate what they are receiving. That's part of the explanation I gave in my video on whether or not Zeus is a predator about things like metaphor and non-consent as metaphor in ancient myth. There are a lot of things about the way that ancient peoples sort of saw these experiences, these revelations as they were, and the way that ancient society worked being radically different than ours. It's not that the gods literally did these things, it's that these are the best ways to explain things about the gods that we might not otherwise be able to grasp. One of the beautiful things about story, and one of the reasons why, for example, my very short, but I'm still working on making more for it, my series Film Crusade, the tagline is Stories Shape Lives. Stories and poems and other art forms can help our minds grasp truths that just simply hearing them might not apply them the way that just consuming or experiencing a story or a memory would. right? It's the difference between being told, if you take this much, of XYZ thing, you're going to get sick, versus actually getting sick, or reading a detailed description of somebody who got sick, right? There's a distinct difference between, well, the statistics say you'll get sick if you take this much, and reading a very detailed story, personal experience recount of somebody who got very ill from taking a lot of that substance. So Katie says, polar opposites in conflict bring about life through balanced dynamics. The two poles can be viewed as opposed, but they actually work together to preserve life. There's probably some truth to that. Yes, absolutely. There's also just the idea in general that the gods sort of help uphold the order of the universe. And so when they may often exist within conflict, or appear that they exist within conflict, that represents a perceived conflict on the part of the forces that they're interested in, on the part of humans. But it may not necessarily be that the gods themselves are necessarily in conflict, because again, we often see that gods that are said to be in conflict in myth were honored together in practice. So if you take practice and myth together, which I heavily suggest people do when you're talking about looking at things from a recon or revivalist mindset, that's one of the best ways to kind of look at those things. So let's see. That's kind of my answer toward that sort of conflict question. Carbuckle says, the gods do have a tendency to claim us without our permission. I tried so hard to be a Hellenist, but ended up getting claimed by the heathen gods. Yeah, I mean, the thing is sometimes we also just resonate more with certain pantheons than we do others. Like, I think that the gods, and this is a personal, like, UPG sort of belief. This is not me saying that this is absolute truth and everybody should believe this too. But I've noticed that folks that gravitate towards certain, like, values and certain ideas have a tendency to end up within certain faiths. I don't know if that has to do with specifically just the quality that attracts those people to the gods, or vice versa. There might be some sort of reciprocal thing. I know that the more that I've worshipped Athena, the more of the qualities, like, that she embodies have started to manifest themselves in my life, especially with the obsession with knitting and crochet and weaving, which I was sort of interested in when I got started in Hellenism, but like really, really obsessively took off afterwards, to the point where my I guess skill in it also sort of accelerated, which was strange, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. So I think that at the very least, I think that there seems to be this sort of push and pull where followers that are particularly attracted to certain qualities will come to certain gods. And I think that some gods will call people to them that are embodying of qualities that they either want to cultivate or that are within their realms of interest. So, like, anyway, that's kind of my viewpoint on conflict in the gods. If it exists, I'm not sure if it's something we can fully understand, because in terms of conflict, the kind of conflict that an unevolved mind would get into, most conflict for us as humans has a lot to do with, like, survival and our survival drives, and the majority of the things that create that conflict have to do with being embodied in our survival drives. So I'm not really sure how that would work. So Scove says, this may be obvious, but what exactly makes a closed tradition closed? I see debate around some traditions, and I don't know what to make of it at times. That's actually a really good question. So closed traditions, to give you guys a definition, closed traditions are traditions that generally require some kind of initiatory or training type expertise in order for you to become a part of them. Whether that is what is colloquially known badly, I might add, as a self-initiation, where you have to go through, say, a particular text or series of training protocols yourself without guidance or with, like, a book as a teacher, or a tradition in which you have to directly get a teacher or a group of teachers or the approval of a community in order to learn the specific practices. Closed traditions don't necessarily mean the gods and spirits of that tradition are always closed. What they do mean are that often many closed traditions either are mystical and initiatory in sense, meaning that you need to get involved with the group themselves. A lot of closed occult traditions are this way. The Golden Dawn was actually like this. Or they are like indigenous traditions that are endangered in some way, usually by colonialism. And so usually you need to kind of integrate yourself into the culture, or at the very least get the approval of a teacher, or participate specifically in ceremonies that are open to the public. And generally there is some sort of approval that you need to go through, either from the community itself or from a teacher, or from elders or such. I know that some indigenous traditions, some Native American tribes do accept people into traditions, but only once they've started to show that they care about the culture beyond just the practices themselves. Whereas some practices, like some potlatches, for example, and some sweat lodges and such, are open to the public from the say tribal council. Like, they have specific open to the public events. So what makes a closed tradition close is generally the either initiatory nature of the tradition, or it is the desire of a particular culture or group to protect that tradition from people attempting to profit on it from the outside. Now, I'm not advocating necessarily for all Native American traditions to be closed, but I would like to, much like I did in my video on folkism, talk a little bit about why some of those traditions are closed. Until the late 1970s, it was literally illegal for people with indigenous heritage and registration to speak our own languages or practice our own traditions. Anybody registered with a tribe was not protected under the First Amendment with the right to speak our languages or practice our traditions. Now, keep in mind, again, I'm not registered with my tribe. I've talked about why many times in the past, but if my family were still registered, if my great-grandfather had not pulled us off the rolls, then we would have been not allowed from, like, my mother would not have been allowed when she was born to speak our language or practice our tradition. So the thing is here, white people and other people that had citizenship, but mostly white people, were actually allowed to do so. They were protected under the First Amendment right to practice what they called, or may have been trained, because at the time a lot more traditions were a lot more open, were versions of our traditions. They were allowed to speak our languages. So when you're talking about cultural protectionism with indigenous tribes, a lot of the time that is what you're talking about. You are talking about people who, up until less than 50 years ago, or actually a little over 50 years ago, were not allowed to speak our languages or practice our own traditions, but white authors were allowed to write about them, and white people were allowed to profit directly off of them. They could hold potlatches, they could hold sweat lodges. We were not allowed to, could be like sterilized or potentially like killed or arrested for doing so. So that's something that, like, when you're talking about closed traditions, the majority of indigenous traditions that you're talking about are situations like that. I know that some Sami traditions are also closed, from what I've heard from folks in the Sami community. Some of them are open, but they are also an indigenous tradition where their like practices for a very, very long time were outlawed. And I know that they don't even have like legal recognition in some of the countries in which they reside, because they are sort of diasporic in the sense that their like ancestral lands that they live on are across multiple countries, and not all of them even recognize them as an indigenous people that live there. So when you're talking about closed traditions, the majority of the time you're talking about an attempt to protect ourselves from predatory colonialism. So that has to do with that. So closing a tradition out of survival and closing a tradition out of bigotry are different. There are also traditions that are closed, again, within occult circles, especially because it is perceived that practicing the tradition wrong could potentially be dangerous. So they're initiatory. There are potential dynamics that can happen if you have negative teachers in those spaces. I'm not advocating for or against closed traditions. I think that closed traditions that are initiatory in nature can be a positive part of communities. It's not quite the same thing as gatekeeping if people aren't being turned away because of immutable characteristics that they can't control. But I do think that in terms of the way that closed traditions work, I don't think that every closed tradition is bigotry. I think that there's a difference, as somebody mentioned, between closing a tradition for survival and closing a tradition specifically for, say, for example, because the practices themselves might be dangerous to somebody who is not trained. So that is that's kind of the answer for open and closed traditions in that. Ikeda says, what does that say about the gods that attract folkists? I honestly, I mean, can we get a we're stronger together and no zini for xenophobes, no frith with folkists in the chat for me, please? So folkism is, I think, an entirely different issue. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm never going to question the faith of like any individual person who says that they believe in the gods, because to be honest, it's not my business. That's between them and the gods. But I think that folkism itself is a completely different issue, and I've talked about it in the past, but there's sort of a like personal supremacy and identity issue there. There's an attempted self-victimization often that folkists do, like especially a lot of folkists are very nationalist, for example. So I think that folkism is less about the gods themselves and more about gatekeeping community over immutable like characteristics. I think that there's this desire to be more special than one actually is because of something that one was born with, this like sense of kind of entitlement often. But there's also a deep sense of sort of disconnection and lack of community that a lot of folkists I've noticed initially face, whereas folkist communities tend to be very tight knit, and so long as you toe the same line, they can appear very accepting. So I think that folkism, although I can roundly condemn it, I think that if you look at it from an empathetic point of view, briefly, just to kind of look at some of the reasons behind it, there's a lot of perceived victimization in like folkist rhetoric often, and it's often connected to sort of nationalist rhetoric, to heritage, to identity, in ways that also tie very closely with community. And often folkists can chase other people who disagree with them out of their life, so they end up becoming more and more dependent on these communities that they've become a part of for that acceptance and care. So like I personally don't know if it's necessarily that folkists are attracted to the gods or the gods are attracted to them, so much as folkism itself seems to be more of like an identity and bigotry issue for creating insular communities. Like, again, I'm not advocating for it. Folkism is wrong and it's exclusionary and it's harmful. But if you try to look at it from a reasoning and empathetic perspective, when you look at like the arguments that they make, a lot of it seems to come from this like strong sense of insecurity. Like, you know, as Misty just said, the far-right nationalism preys on the same people as cults do, vulnerable, outcast, struggling, and hurt. And a lot of folkist organizations are very, very cult-like in the way that they operate. So, Mr. Monster says, do you know what happened to the Norse Path? He was popular last year, but I can't see any of his videos this year. I have no idea, and that counts as community drama and gossip, so even if I knew, I'd let you know to probably go research it elsewhere. I don't really know all that much about what happened with that. So, anyway, I think I'm almost done with all of the starter questions. So, I actually have not seen Hellboy, by the way, for the other starter question that was on the subreddit, so I don't actually know about the portrayal there with Hecate. So, let's see what questions I have missed in the live chat from the beginning, because I'm going to try to go in order. So, let's see if I missed anything from the live chat. Let's see. I am scrolling. I'm sorry if this is boring for a second while I look. Oh, somebody asked me how I'm doing. I'm freaking tired, guys. I've been going through some stuff, as you all know. I've been dealing with the flood in the basement. We've actually taken a whole bunch of bids for the contract work because our insurance is covering it all. I have to take at least, I believe it's 4 of them. And then I have to compare them, forward them all to my insurance, pick which person I want to work with, and then the insurance is going to negotiate with them. So I'm trying to get all of that set up for the repairs, because the mitigation, which is the period of time where they're cleaning up all of the water and kind of trying to dry everything out down there, that got finished on Monday. So now I'm in the phase where like the insurance and I are haggling over who's going to do the fixing work, so to speak, the repairs. So let's see. If you, honestly, there has been so much chat that trying to go all the way back up. If you had a question that I missed that I haven't answered yet, please post that quickly. And I'll start just posting the ones that are kind of on my screen at the moment, because I tried to go scrolling back up. So let's see. There is great work to be done in de-radicalizing friends and focused friends and family members. Absolutely. If you have the spoons to do it. Now, trying to do it on public forums like Twitter can get you harassed. I generally advise the people not engage with the focus that, like, for example, attack me, because, well, they're known to go after people for months, even years. Like, they've been after me for a good 1.5 years, 2 years now. And like, I only talked about them on the channel, 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 at most. So like they'll just get mad at me at random and decide to kick up a dust storm. So yeah, like I advise, if you see folkism online, if you're brave, go after it, but just be known that sometimes these folks can be very dangerous, and both real world and online violence and stalking and harassing are absolutely things that have happened in the past. I know that this particular group has ostensibly, allegedly doxed somebody that I know in the past, and they have attempted to dox me. There was a image of a signing that I went to with my authorial name portrayed in one of the videos that they made about me. So yeah, like there have been attempts on those lines on my end as well, like from them. So be careful if you speak out against them. Just make sure you protect yourself. So let's see. Are you going to do a Hellboy watch party to find out? That actually could potentially be an event in the server. Guys, let me know in the comments after the stream, not in the live chat, but in the comments after the stream if that's something you'd like to do in the Discord server. So let's see. What are your thoughts on the philosophical outlook in the Ghibli films? It depends on the film. There's some very interesting sort of like nature versus civilization themes in a lot of Ghibli films. I think that there's also sort of this lionization of childlike innocence in a lot of them. But I'd have to really do sort of a deep dive into them and learn a lot more about like Shinto, because there's a lot of, from what I understand, Shinto symbolism. There's a lot of kami representation and such. And so I'd want to learn a lot more about that before commenting too deeply on it. Because I feel like when you're understanding Japanese media that references those things, you want to have a stronger understanding than I currently do of the themes that are directly being referenced there. So Jamie says, thoughts about God in video games? God of War, Smite, Immortals, Phoenix Rising. So the only of those that I've played is actually Smite. However, I'm working on a video on the Hades video game that is a highly requested topic, and one that I thoroughly enjoy the platformer. I love the sort of in-game joke, which I won't spoil, not until I put out the video anyway. There's an in-game joke involving Orpheus and specifically Zagreus in the game, and it is hilarious. And I was like, they're not acknowledging this until the joke happened. For those of you who have played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But for those of you who are familiar with the Orphic hymns that inspired some of the game, it is very, very interesting. I think there are some things that they kind of got wrong about the sort of layout of the way that Hades was supposed to be, with Tartaros, Elysium, and I'm trying to remember what the other area in there is, but it was just like plain Hades was the first layer. But it is definitely a fascinating video game. I enjoy the heck out of it. It has got some of the most gorgeous artwork I've seen. Like, it is a completely unique style. I love the mechanics of it. The storytelling in it, I think that the personifications of the gods, the way that they are portrayed, is largely accurate, with the exception of, and I haven't gotten far enough to know how apparently this turns around, Hades being the villain, and that sort of estranged marriage issue between him and Persephone. I haven't gotten further than that. I haven't gotten far enough in there to kind of see that turnaround, because I've been told that there are changes that happen, and I want to get far enough myself without watching Let's Plays and stuff to find that out. But him being the villain at the start of the game is a little bit irritating to me to begin with. But I still overall have really enjoyed the hell out of the game. I love the way that the boons work. I love this game. Like, I really just do. So I think, though, that most games misrepresenting the gods knowingly, I think that most people don't actually understand polytheism well enough to realize the ways in which they're misrepresenting the gods. I think that we often assume that our knowledge is significantly better than, I think that we assume people's knowledge is better than, like, it is most of the time. A lot of non-polytheists still kind of believe that of the gods as, like, archetypes, or sort of, god of wisdom means that's, like, that. Exploring the ramifications of that is not something that non-polytheists often do. And I don't know how many polytheists work on these things in a way that they could influence the portrayals of these gods in such a way that, for example, a studio wouldn't necessarily stop it. So I'm not entirely sure how much of that is willful and how much of it is just a mistake, but I do think, as I've said before, that it's Asphodel. Asphodel is the thing that I missed. Thank you, guys. but like I think that it's a lot less willful and a lot more just plain ignorance, I think. And I've said before, I think that all like art is divinely inspired. So I think that the gods have a hand in a lot of these things, with the exception of gods of Egypt. Press F to pay respects, please. So that's sort of my thought on the games that I played. I've also played Smite, but I mostly played it kind of at the beginning when it was first coming out, so I'm not sure if my opinions still hold weight. I think that it's really interesting. I really think that media is a gateway into people exploring mythology and exploring history and exploring polytheism quite often. I think that, ironically, that is one of the few things that monotheists are actually kind of right about, is that it is sort of, it piques people's curiosity. And I think that in that way, it can help people connect to the gods, even if they don't initially understand them to begin with. But I think overall that media involving the gods most of the time is actually a positive thing. So would you mind sharing the title of the books you're writing? I love reading and would love to support you that way. Well, I currently have 2 novels out. Currently, Diary of the Hollow and Covenant of the Hollow. I'm working on the sequel to those, Prisoner of the Hollow, which is going to be a total of a 4-book series. So if you guys are interested in those, you can look those up on Amazon. They're available on there. You can actually read them on Kindle Unlimited, or you can just pick them up either in paperback, or they're very inexpensive, both of them, in ebook, because I wanted to make sure people could afford them if they check them out. So let's see. Former right-wing person, not to sound like a broken record, but it's like a cult, and like with a cult, trying to deconvert someone or trying to leave or go against yourself can be dangerous. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's see. People talking about God of War, which again I haven't really played. There's a lot of gaps. So I haven't seen Blood of Zeus yet. Somebody talking about Blood of Zeus here. Alexandria says Blood of Zeus did a great job of portraying the gods, except maybe Hera. I haven't seen it. It looked a little strange to me. Like, the animation style was not my cup of tea when I first saw the previews for it, but I've gotten enough requests that I probably will check it out for Film Crusade at some point. Let's see. I'm still trying to look. Lots and lots of F's in chat. Not really a question, but a comment. Really appreciated the clarification on testing. Made me realize that late in Christianity, my idea of testing is based on the scarier form of Christianity. Oh, you're welcome. Let's see. Do we have any more questions that I missed? Can you guys give me a repost on that if I missed anybody's stuff? Like, I really kind of want to keep going with questions. If I missed anything in the preview questions as well that I didn't initially say I wasn't going to answer on stream in my replies, let me know also. So let's see. I haven't played Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I'm not a big fan of the just Assassin's Creed gameplay in general, so I'm not sure if I will check it out. People were nagging me too. Maybe if people nag me enough, I might give in, but... So, yeah, when I was playing, Focus was still a thing, so... Let's see. I would slightly disagree with the cult thing with the right wing. I agree with that the right wing is far more cult-like, especially now, but both sides are mostly stuck in their echo chambers. If we're talking about echo chambers and things, I think that both sides do have a problem with building effigies of each other, but I do think that when you're talking about lefty politics, I've noticed that we actually engage with the arguments that are being presented on the right in a more honest way, more consistently on the whole. Whereas the right, I've noticed, tends to engage with things that they assume we're going to say more often than not. That is my experience, at least. So I think that there is a difference between the way that both tend to engage with each other. So let's see. Mr. Monster with the $2 super chat. I already answered that question. I have no idea. Let's see. Ikeda says, thank you for doing this. The Supreme Court has given me much fear about the future. Just listening to you makes me feel better. Thank you so much, Ikeda. How would one know if the gods reject an offering or request? That's actually a really good question. I talked about this in my video on offerings. There are 2 sort of feelings. One of them, it's actually talked about in ancient writings. I'll have to go reference, but I talked about it in the video. I'm pretty sure I gave a citation. If I didn't, nag me in the comments on that video and I will find the citation for you. It was from the book Smoke Signals for the Gods was where they first referenced this. In ancient writings, they talked about how when an animal was sacrificed, and I'm this, like, in terms of VPG, we can translate this to other forms of offering. If the priest appeared and felt more like a butcher than a sacred official, then it was said that the gods had fled the statues and thereby were no longer there to accept the offering. There were also things like with entrails that or Montes, that they could interpret, but we don't really have any of those records surviving for how that worked. With incense, it was said that if the incense blew towards you, or rather than kind of going up toward the gods, that there was a chance that that could be a offering that was not accepted. Though obviously, if you're talking about wind and drafts and stuff in your house, there might be something a little different there. There's mostly, though, the feeling that you get after the offering is generally the best indicator from what I've read. There is this sensation that one gets when the gods reject you that is pretty significant. So let's see. Do you have any advice for people torn between following different religious traditions? There are actually a couple of different solutions to this. I talked about this in my video, What's Your Approach to Paganism? You can either explore syncretism between the two, so kind of figuring out what you feel you can combine or, say, lose from one tradition and adopt from the other and like work them together through syncretism. Or you can attempt to practice a form of multi-traditionalism where you practice different religious traditions separately from one another, say different shrines and altars, or, packing up the objects on a shrine and altar and, placing other objects on top of it for different practices. I tend to practice a form of multi-traditionalism where I have separate shrines for Haida-related practice and my drum, versus when you're talking about Hellenism, there's an entirely separate space for that within my temple room. So when you're talking about that, I don't generally, this actually comes back to one of the questions that I got on the server, which was about syncretism versus multi-traditionalism with Haida and Greek practice. I do not combine them. I see them as kind of opposed to each other in terms of the tradition itself. I've never experienced deities like opposing each other or getting in the way with each other, like, which is part of the reason why I get confused by the question like around conflict, because I'm not entirely sure if the gods have conflict, if we would understand it anyway. But when you're talking about being torn between religious traditions, it's worth it to, at the very least, see what works for you and what doesn't, and what works within your relationships with the gods and what doesn't. Because some folks, for example, say somebody who's primarily heathen but wants to honor a Hellenic deity, they could potentially offer to that Hellenic deity in a heathen way, a la syncretism, and that deity, if they respond positively to that, then at that point you've syncretically brought that Hellenic deity into your heathen tradition. And, but you could do something similar vice versa with a Hellenic deity, like with a Hellenic praxis and a heathen tradition. Or you could attempt to combine those practices in some way that you feel comfortable with, the things that you feel are similar, versus dropping some practices that might not be necessarily useful in the other tradition. Have you ever gotten the feeling that a god was busy or just not able to be available to accept an offering? Not personally, no. I've heard folks that have that feeling, but I've never experienced that personally. So, Heathenry Simplified gives the advice: I would very much engage in both or in either, and find the one that calls to you more, or even just melding them together based on personal experience and works best for you. That's kind of similar to the advice that I just gave. Yeah, you absolutely can ask polytheistic questions if you want to. People have been asking me polytheistic questions all night. So the only thing that's off limits is community drama. I will not talk about community drama or other creators. Just don't ask me questions about that. That's not my shindig. So let's see. Yeah, and Heathenry Simplified actually brings up a good point here. Most heathens do specifically do some kind of syncretism as it is, because there's not a ton of sources for heathenry. So a lot of Reconstructionists pull from Hellenism and other related traditions within like similar geographic areas that we know interacted with them. They pull practices and things because of like sort of perceived shared roots between the traditions, and the fact that we know that these traditions syncretized with each other. So there's a good chance that some of these practices, like ritual cleanliness, for example, could have been present as well in heathenry and other traditions that we might not have as much attestation for that survived into the modern day. So, Scove says, I used to describe my situation as torn between paths, but now I consider it extreme indecisiveness as to whether I'm convinced of or want to follow various paths. I mean, the thing is, to me, the antidote for that is attempted practice and seeing how well it works for you, meaning what sort of response you get from the entities that you're trying to interact with, be they gods, spirits, kami, etc. If you are talking about, being torn between traditions, the only way to ultimately make that decision is to experience that tradition for yourself and see what you get back from the entities that you are attempting to interact with and establish reciprocity with. There's no real substitute for that. No amount of research is necessarily going to decide that for you. In my experience, at least, the only thing that showed me that being a Hellenist was the right path for me was diving headfirst into Reconstruction and trying it. And, lots and lots of trial and error, honestly. The worst thing that you can do is end up having to do propitiation because, something happened and you ended up getting a sign that a particular spirit or deity was not particularly happy about it. What would you say is the most underrated Hellenic deity? Honestly, I would say Ares. I've actually made a case for community SPG about Ares. A lot of people are very hesitant to approach him because he's perceived as only being for warriors, but there is a ton of community SPG, myself included, around Ares and PTSD, even non-combat related PTSD and other mental health conditions. And I very much think that as much as he was both said to be the most hateful to the gods because of his warlike nature, he was also had roles in, for example, just overthrowing of governance and such, which, for folks who have ever participated in protests, I'm sure that actually rings a pretty strong bell for you guys. But there's also, the attestations between Ares and madness and foot soldiers and caring for them after they return from war. And that is where I think a lot of the modern SPG, specifically from for PTSD and mental health related struggles and mental health battles, comes from. And I am here for that. I think that as the gods have, as the people who follow the gods, our needs and cultures change, the way they interface with us does as well. It's why I tend to lean myself more towards revivalism than, quote, strict reconstruction. And so when you're talking about sort of the way that gods are worshipped and you're talking about the way that we interface with them, the ancient view of these gods may be very different than the modern worshippers' experience of them, because our experiences are also, as the ancients were, going to be colored by our understanding. And we know a lot more about science now than the ancients did, right? We understand the connections between these things. And so as our needs have changed, as there are significantly less Hellenists, say, out there on the battlefield worshiping these gods, and a lot more people that are dealing with these mental health struggles, which Ares also had an interest in, given that, PTSD and such within his purview, it makes a lot of sense that you would see a lot more interfacing with the god on this particular question. So let's see. Hellenian, I'm not going to give, again, that kind of starts to get into community drama territory. Hellenian was a group that I was a part of for a while. There was some infighting within the group that I am not particularly fond of, and so I left. They specifically didn't want me doing debate, among other things. For Hellenian, I think that their resources are wonderful. I thought that their community, when I was there, the larger community, was wonderful. There are some problems in their approach and their leadership that I have, but it's not something that I'm going to talk about publicly. So I don't really know much about Elion, though. So yeah, and Homeric Hymn to Ares does specifically mention asking for help controlling fear and rage. Absolutely. Yeah, the madness and such that were related to the battlefield, that PTSD, that sort of mental health struggle that is very much within his purview, and it seems to be where Ares is most frequently engaged with by modern worshippers who do decide to engage with him. Though obviously for those of you that are soldiers, he's still there for that also. Hey, I am not knocking recons. I'm saying that in terms of a strict reconstructionist approach versus a revivalist approach, I'm not talking about revivalism as in pure eclecticism. I'm talking about a combination of recon and eclecticism to form a practice, because I think that necessarily there's going to be a certain element of eclecticism and UPG to anybody's practice. Because if you believe in the gods as living beings, quote unquote, living here meaning, engaging with, active, existing in the world, if you engage with the gods as real and as beings, then you're going to have experiences with them that may not necessarily line up exactly with the myths. Not every single bit of UPG is going to be VPG, and I don't think it's good to discard all of it because it's not VPG all the time. I think that SPG in the modern day is just as valid, and I think that especially wide-ranging community SPG can be authoritative towards people crafting practices and such, because again, the only thing that really gives VPG its authority is antiquity. So, and if you have no UPG as a Hellenist, that's perfectly valid too. I've talked about mind-blind folks and folks that don't have UPG. Like, I have talked about that extensively on the channel when I've talked about UPG and such. So it's perfectly fine to not have UPG. I'm just saying that for those of us that do, there is value in that. So let's see. They didn't want you to debate. Is that something you wanted to do? Are there polytheist topics you want to debate? Back then, I was involved a lot more in the debate sphere. Jake 40, I'm pretty sure you know of what I refer. I actually did do a debate a long time ago. It was a Jewish person, a Christian, an atheist, and a pagan head-to-head, all four of us. And I specifically took on Sigart more or less with Surus. Because people didn't realize that Surus and I knew each other, and we were mostly in agreement on most things, so it ended up being the two of us kind of debating Sigart with the other person sort of just being in the background. So I did actually do a lot more debate stuff, particularly with Christians way back in the day. It's not something that I'm as interested in anymore. Like, I'm more interested in creating sort of long-form arguments and essays. I'm not as convinced of the validity and usefulness of the debate medium anymore. It might be something I could do again in the future, but it's not something I'm as interested in anymore. I feel like the work that I'm doing now, more towards allyship and education, is far more useful than the sort of antagonistic relationship I had with the community back then. So Hermes being a patron of thieves, I do have thoughts on this. Absolutely. So first off, Hermes being a patron of thieves, a lot of that comes from the fact that, according to, if I recall correctly, the Homeric hymn, he was born and his first act was to go and take off with his brother's cattle and then lie his ass off about it until Zeus lost his shit laughing and, eventually confronts him, and then he makes the lyre and makes Apollon friend. So the thing is, thievery. Hermes has aspects for almost all forms of exchange and transformation. Like, he has aspects for the exchange of information, aka like messages, exchange of goods, aka the marketplace, and like mercantilism, and like the exchange of goods, bringing the souls of the dead as a psychopomp to Styx. His role primarily was as a facilitator of exchange. So unwilling exchange, a la thieves, absolutely is within the purview of Hermes. Now, when you're talking about thievery, is thievery already inherently bad? I don't know. If somebody is starving to death and they steal a loaf of bread, are you going to fault them? I mean, if you have this absolutist rule of law approach, you're going to say, well, yeah, they should go to jail. But like, I think most of us understand there's a distinct difference between stealing something because you want it and stealing something because you need it. Right? Like, most thieves are people trying to get by, as Misty points out here. I think that there's a line, especially because Hermes, for example, was sent in the myths to steal things from mortals and from like other gods when they were supposed to be there. There are actually many stories of Hermes helping heroes to steal things from like deities or from various places. The golden apples, for example. So when you're talking about thievery is not a complete moral bad at all times. Now, stealing from a temple absolutely is. But when you're talking about thievery in general, as per most things, context matters. So it was said, and I've seen this in a few different places. I'll have to actually find the attestation because people have asked me for it before. It was said that Hermes, if you were a home that did not honor him and there was a thief that did, that Hermes would side with the thief instead of protecting the boundary. Because again, his facilitation, his interest is the exchange. It's speed, information, wit, ideas, and physical goods. So he also has aspects of transformation, among other things. But when you're talking about thievery, again, is it a universal bad? Well, I mean, the gods do things that are not favorable to humans, like having a loaf of bread stolen from a shop so that somebody can feed their family. I don't necessarily know if you can say that that is a universal evil, right? Like, Akeda brings up a good point. If society took better care of the poor, there would be no need to steal. Exactly. Like, people don't tend to steal just for fun. Like, some do. Like, some rich people just go off and they will steal because they, want to for fun. But the majority of people, like, that do, it's usually a survival thing. Like, most people have some idea of right and wrong and don't necessarily want to do bad things. So let's see, is making dedicated candles and adding associated herbs a good replacement for statues on altars? Also, is lighting it when giving offerings, devotional acts, or wanting to spend time with them okay? Absolutely, that's something that you could do. In terms of representations, I talked about this in my video on the broom closet. Representation of deities on altars are very personal. Making candles like that, I would generally actually count those as being votive offerings because you're burning them down. So the gods kind of coming into them to accept the offering the way that you would have for an icon might not necessarily be as possible, or I'm not absolutely sure, actually. You'd have to kind of look into that a little bit to see what your experience is of it. But making candles as votive and devotional offerings, lighting it when giving offerings, that's absolutely a thing. I light a lamp to Hestia every single time I make any offerings whatsoever at my altar. So yeah, that's something that you could absolutely do. So Katie, I hope that answers your question. Or was that Katie? Yeah, I think that was. Let's see. The person who asked, Yesenia was the one who asked the questions. The question about the candles. Can we learn things about the gods from astrological natures of the planets or other celestial bodies named after them, or should these be kept separate? I'm not absolutely certain how to answer that question, actually. I know that in ancient times, astrology was a thing, though I think it became a bigger thing during Roman times, if I recall correctly. I think that a lot of the astral bodies being named, like, for example, when you're talking about, like, the constellations specifically, a lot of those have strong associations with mythology. I personally don't give a ton of credence to astrology. I know there are a lot of the folks in the community that do, and I think that that's valid if they want to. But my personal opinion in my own praxis is that I tend to rely on other information for divination and such, and I tend to rely a lot more on myth and praxis for my information about the deities themselves. I keep them separate in my own praxis, but I think that it's valid for folks who want to use these things if they decide to. Just make sure that you keep track of what's useful and what's not when you do. So let's see. Yeah, and Heathen Ream mentions, all forms of tradition are living traditions. The things with Recon is it's trying to bring back a broken tradition. The key is knowing you'll never get it 100%. Well, and I mean, those traditions would have changed over time, too. Like, living traditions that exist today are not exactly the same as they were 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, right? Like, even living traditions that are quote-unquote unbroken change over time. They change with the needs of the community and with, the changing relationship between the community and the gods and the changing understanding of those gods. So, like, as time went on, classical era, like, Greek belief was very different than Hellenistic era Greek belief, which changed over time. And the way that Recons interface with our gods is different than the way that the ancients did as well. So when you're looking at this stuff, it's going to change over time. So let's see. Oh, hey, Frosty, welcome. Let's see. Is there a particular muse related to math and science? When you're talking about math and science specifically, actually, in ancient times, those were more related to philosophy. So we're back to Athena and Zeus and Hermes, primarily. So let's see. That's, I think... Ty, as far as the difference between recons and revivalists, I think that that's oversimplifying it a little bit, but it is what it is. Do you guys have any more questions, or should I sort of wrap up with stuff that's going to be going on in the future? I am hoping to hecken back. I have most of the script done that was supposed to be for the Thanksgiving video. I'm hoping to hecken back that I will have time. We're supposed to have the contractors out on Monday, but on Tuesday, I'm hoping to be able to get the video out for patrons, and I'm hoping to get the 5 indigenous activists you've never heard of video out for Thursday next week. I'm really, really excited about that. As I mentioned, I'm also working on a video on ancient Greek divination. I've got a number of sources that have come in for that. I'm still waiting for the book Montike, so I'm hoping that that will come in time for me to have that done in the next 2 weeks. But I am hoping to talk a little bit about divination, what it can and can't do for you, divinatory ethics, etc. It's going to be a series of videos, and I'm hoping to do them all in a row. I'm also working at present on the script for the snakes of the snake hybrids of Hellenism, the part 2 of my snakes video series. I'm working on the script for that and the snakes and the gods. Snake symbolism and deities and snake worship in Hellenism. I'm working on both of those, so those are going to be there. So let's see. What are the primary differences between Hellenistic and classical praxis? The answer is there are a lot of differences. For one thing, you start to see significant syncretism with Roman religion. In the Hellenistic era, you also start to see significant syncretism, significantly more so than even in the classical era, with Egyptian praxis as well, because of the nature of sort of a ruled and quote-unquote unified empire under that in that era. So you start to see a lot more rigidity in certain kinds of praxis. You start to see an emphasis on different sort of cultist activities. There was an emergence of significantly more mystery cults and such. They're like praxis evolved a great deal over time between the archaic and classical eras and between the classical and the Hellenistic era. So let's see. I think that's most of the actually most of the questions that I have in the chat. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I hope that you all felt like I got to your questions as best as I could. I did try to make sure that I checked the comment section last time as well, and I'm pretty sure that I got all of the questions from there as well. If I missed anything, let me know down in the comments after the stream. Please do hit the like button if you guys are here, or just dislike if you never want to see my face again. That's perfectly fine. It'll take me out of the algorithm for you, but I'm glad that you were here and hung out with me for a bit. All 50 of you guys did make it through the majority of the stream, so thank you all so much for hanging out with me on a Saturday night gang. I might start doing Saturday streams from time to time. So as I said, am there's apparently one more question. Okay, let's see. I'm curious about the sun and moon question. What did I miss? How do you deal with being a different culture from Hellenism? How I deal with it is I understand that my praxis isn't going to look identical to a Greek Hellenist's practice or toward the practice of the ancients. And make allowances for the differences in culture. So let's see. I'm not sure if I missed another question about the sun and moon. Oh, here we go. How do I conceptualize the existence of multiple sun and moon gods, but there only being one sun and moon? The way that works as far as hard polytheism goes is, for one thing, the sun and moon gods, some of them were considered by the ancients to be the literal sun and moon, but a lot of them also had aspects outside of that. Again, when you think about, for example, in the Hellenistic era, Apollon was like syncretized with Helios as being a sun deity, but he also ruled over things like music. He ruled over divination and oracle work and such. He was considered to be a deliverer from disease and pests and such. And so when you look at the way that various sun gods were, when you look at, say, an Aztec sun god, what you're looking at is a very, very different sort of viewpoint on what that deity is. When you look at Ra has very, very different aspects. And so when you're talking about a sun deity, again, when we conceptualize deities, what we're looking at is not the literal body of this being the sun or moon, but more the luminous nature of that god. We perceive them as being the light of the sun or the moon, the things that, like the heat and warmth and, for example, purification in the case of Apollo, or the sort of heat and destructive power in the case of Helios. When you're talking about the aspects of those deities, that is how we perceive them. That is the things that we come to understand about the nature of that god through our perceptions of them as being associated with these celestial deities. So I'm hoping that that makes sense. Ty, I don't think we disagree on as many things as you think. Like, and I appreciate you being here. I appreciate when folks disagree with me in a very polite way, and I enjoy having discussions. So anyhow, I am going to wrap up the stream because we are at the end, but I hope that that answered your question, Rule of Two, and the other person who mentioned that they were interested in hearing the end of that. I'm going to get back into sort of what I was trying to say at the end, which is my future plans and such. So I already mentioned in the Discord the list of the 5 Indigenous activists you've never heard of that I'm doing the bios on. I'm not going to be doing a super extensive deep dive into all of their lives, but I will talk about their primary life's work. It's shaping up to be a 20 to 25 minute video as it is just with the 5. I was going to try to do 7, but holy crap, there are so many cool people and some awesome like anecdotes. There's one involving knitting that I shared with my patrons that was really, really awesome, and I'm super excited to share it with all of you guys later when I actually do the recording. So I'm hoping to get that out by Thursday. If there's something that stops me, I will announce it both on the subreddit and in Discord. I'm really hoping to see some more activity on the subreddit. I'm really hoping to help build a thriving community there. I do respond to most of the threads there, so if you guys do join, I will see the stuff. I check it every day. So I'm really excited to have that going. As I mentioned, calendar project, we should be launching the Kickstarter for that pretty soon. And I'm working on a number of videos, both videos that I've promised to do in series and videos that I have sort of been kicking around, like the divination one and the one on propitiation versus reciprocity and the sort of value of honoring so-called baneful or wrathful gods. So I'm really excited to discuss that. I've actually been talking with some other friends in the like wider pagan community about the viewpoints from other traditions, and at least one of them might be willing to let me reference some of their experiences as well in the video. So I'm really, really excited to have the sort of combined effort there, the experience and I guess allyship in that particular video, because it is such a complex and layered topic. So thank you all again so much. Links to both the subreddit and the Discord are in the description below. There's at least one mod in the subreddit from this, like from the Discord server as well. So if you guys like the mod team over there, then there are going to be at least one mods over there. I'm talking to other folks within the mod team about whether or not they want to be there, or whether I need to like potentially look into Reddit for like people that have experience modding Reddit as well. So look out for that in the future. But I want to thank you guys again so much for hanging out with me. As I say at the end of every one of my streams, we're stronger together. Thank you all so much. Please drop down into the comments. Let me know if there's anything in particular that you enjoyed, or if there's questions that you want me to answer in the future. My next live stream is probably going to have an actual theme, I'm hoping. The Q&A streams were more or less because I've been kind of putting off doing another one, and because things have been a little bit rough on my end lately, but I'm hoping to either talk about current events or do an actual theme next time. So as I said, we're stronger together. Drop down into the comments, let me know how I did, and I will see you all soon.